Part 2. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 11. The next morning, light snow fell on thousands of streets and hundreds of squares. The majestic Chang'an looked like a giant beast lying on the snowy field. The roads leading to all corners of the country were the hair on the giant beast's body, connecting every corner of the thousands of miles of territory. There were still a few months before the New Year's Eve. Song Yufu walked out of Wenquiyuan, holding a stack of books in her hands, and looked up at the falling snowflakes from the sky. The new year is coming soon, and her father, Song Baking, will have to go through the motions at the dragon poetry recital in a few days. It's just that her father felt that literatize poetry is like a martial artist's embroidered fists and legs. It can nourish one's character, but it is difficult to stabilize the country. He never looked down on the talented people who competed for the top spot in poetry gatherings, so he left all these trivial matters to her to take care of. Song Yufu was a female prostitute and would not be able to be an official in the future. Naturally, she didn't care about the saying that she was a little talent in poetry but a great talent in political affairs. She was content with just reading a few pleasing poems. But in the past few days, she couldn't get interested, and she didn't know if it was because of Prince Su. Su Shizi has been in Chang'an City for a year. He has spent very little time in the Imperial College. When he came, he stayed alone in the Bell and Drum Tower. In the past, she would only pass by him without much negotiation. But a few days ago, Prince Su stood up for the Wolf Guard and lectured Xiao Ting, who was looking rudely, which made her a little curious about this high-ranking prince. He is obviously a very calm and sensible gentleman, but why do he always show off his domineering appearance to others? He forces her to copy books, throws her around to scare her. Maybe he talks too much and annoys Prince Su. After a few days of contact, Prince Su is actually not very fierce. Song Yufu was thinking wildly and stretched out her little hand to catch a few snowflakes. The collar of her coat swept across her neck, and her heart seemed to be itching. Song Yufu turned her eyes and looked at the Bell and Drum Tower standing in the center of the Imperial College. After hesitating for a moment, she walked over with graceful steps. Although she knew that Prince Su would definitely let her copy the book in the past, she was still curious about what kind of person he was. If you want to copy books, just copy books. The Bell and Drum Tower is a very solemn place. The Don't Forget bell on it represents Daio's hardships of enduring humiliation for hundreds of years in a small place. Usually no one comes here, so it is very quiet. Song Yufu was a little hesitant, so she walked very lightly and walked to the room under the Bell and Drum Tower. When she was hesitating whether to say hello or how to say hello, she heard a burst of conversation. What bad poem did you buy? There will be a dragon poetry meeting in a few days. Young Prince, the article was written by nature, and it was accidentally acquired by a good hand. Song Yufu was stunned and stood there quickly, with a bit of astonishment in her eyes. It is common for princes and noble sons to buy poems and go to literary fairs to be arty. Most of the sons of rich men who are ignorant and unskilled in Wenquiyuan have done this. This kind of behavior cannot be said to be a heinous crime, but orthodox literati have always looked down upon such people. She didn't expect that Su Shizi, a high-ranking and powerful person who had always stayed away from the dust, would do such a thing. Prince Su is the eldest son of King Su. He is a proud son of heaven. He doesn't need the reputation of a scholar at all. Why would he do such an arty and ridiculous thing? There was imperceptible disappointment in Song Yufu's eyes. After thinking about it, she couldn't dissuade her. She was about to turn around and leave silently, but the next words in the room made her freeze on the spot. The doors and windows of the small room under the Bell and Drum Towers were closed. Su Buling sat upright in front of the writing desk, holding a stack of poems in his hand. Lao Xiao stood in front of him with his cane as a counselor, shaking his head. Little Prince, all literati are arrogant, and it is shameful to sell poems to make money. There are only a few talented people who dare to sell poems, and they are not sold unless they are acquaintances. It took me a long time to find out about Lao Xiao, and it took a lot of money. Silver. Su Buling frowned and looked at the thick stack of poems, feeling a little worried. Rich kids buy poetry to show off, not to make a fool of themselves. The talented people who sell poetry know the hearts of consumers very well, and the poems they write are all quite satisfactory. They can't be called dross or masterpieces. You can read them anyway, and real literati have no time to care about whether they buy such poems that are forgotten in the blink of an eye. If Su Buling wants to be known as a poem thief, first of all, the poem must not be too bad, otherwise it will not be popular. People don't care if he wrote it. Even if they know that he bought it, they won't because of it. This kind of tasteless poetry is more genuine. Thinking of the tasks assigned by Mrs. Liu, Su Buling had a headache and threw the poem aside. Can't you buy a good one? Is it the same as Chang'an? Old Xiao rubbed his crutches and rolled his eyes. Young prince, don't say anything about Chang'an. If you have the ability to cover the Imperial College, people will not sell poems to make money. Why don't you write 2 poems yourself? Su Buling thought about it for a while and found this was the only way. Lao Xiao carried him out of the mountain of corpses and sea of blood last year. He had nothing to be wary of, so he polished his pen and wrote a few sentences on rice paper. Lao Xiao knew that Su Buling's brain had improved after his serious illness, but he had never written poetry before. At this time, he stretched his neck and chanted slowly along with the handwriting. When I was drunk, I read the sword by burning the lamp, and I dreamed about the trumpet playing camp. I finished the affairs of the king and won the reputation both in life and in life. This pity happened in vain. No, no, no. Su Buling was stunned and tilted his head. Why not? I am 18 years old and obviously cannot write this poem. Poetry is not as simple as piling up words. Without the experience of seeing all kinds of life, it is impossible to write such a sense of vicissitudes of life. Su Buling wanted others to see that he was stealing poetry, so he naturally wrote something that was inappropriate for his age group. In his opinion, this poem is perfectly fine. But Lao Xiao shook his head and said seriously, Young prince, General Su has been a soldier all his life. You wrote these few sentences to commemorate your ancestors. If those literati think of this, they will think that this poem was indeed written by you. Su Buling frowned, but he forgot about it. He thought about it and picked up the pen to write again. Withered vines, old trees, crows, small bridges, flowing water, people's homes, ancient roads, west wind, thin horses, setting sun, heartbroken people at the end of the world. After Su Buling finished writing, he raised his eyebrows. Is this okay? I, the prince of a vassal king, can't have such a miserable situation. Lao Xiao frowned and looked at him for a few times, revealing some emotion. Last year, I was ambushed in the Wei River. I hid and fled to Chang'an carrying the prince on my back. The scene on the road was quite similar to this poem. Su Buling frowned. For the first time, he found that copying poems was so difficult. He didn't remember much of the poem, so after thinking for a while, he could only pick up the pen and rewrite it. 10 years of life and death, I can't forget it without thinking about it. 1,000 miles away, lonely grave, nowhere to talk about the desolation. Old Xiao looked at the neat handwriting on the rice paper carefully, his eyes showed a bit of desolation, raised his hand and gently patted Su Buling's shoulder. The princess died of depression because of the iron eagle hunting deer incident 10 years ago. The prince has never let it go. I didn't expect that you, the little prince, saw it. Pa. Su Buling slapped the brush on the table and spread his hands helplessly. This is not written by me, I copied it. I can't even fool you, how can I fool those literati? Old Xiao sighed and looked at Su Buling with a bit of relief. as if he was watching a little kid who finally grew up to be a man who can stand on his own. Su Buling had nothing to say. He sat at the desk and thought hard for a long time before picking up the pen again and writing. The wind has stopped, the dust has settled, the flowers have withered, and I am tired of combing my hair at dusk. Things have changed, and everything has stopped. I want to speak, but tears flow first. Lao Xiao's eyes lit up, and he leaned forward to take a closer look. This poem doesn't seem to be written by a man. It sounds like a poor woman who has experienced many hardships and has no one to rely on. Ordinary people can't write it. Then this one, I don't believe they can't tell that I copied it. Outside the room, Song Yufu's almond eyes were wide open, and she covered her mouth tightly, as if she had discovered a treasure, with shock in her eyes. My God! Cited poems at will, and the style is sophistry. Veteran general on the battlefield, down and out wanderer, sad literati, resentful woman in the boudoir. The transitions between various roles are seamless, as if he had really experienced it himself, and there is nothing wrong with it. This poetry foundation is inhuman. Song Yufu's eyelashes trembled constantly, and she wanted to rush in and read those poems right now. But as soon as the thought came up, she stopped again. From what Su Shiza said just now, he didn't want to be famous, and he also wanted to bear the bad reputation of stealing poems. Although she didn't understand the intention of doing so, could she not know whether Su Shiza stole poems? Song Yufu was born in a scholarly family. Her father and brother were both great scholars. How could she sit and watch a person with real talent and learning lose his reputation? If she went in now, Su Shiza would know that she was eavesdropping, and he would definitely not go to the poetry meeting. Then, Song Yufu narrowed her eyes slightly, and a bit of cunning appeared in her sparkling eyes. Ruthless vote-seeking robot. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 12. In the evening of the next day, when the lanterns were first turned on, there were cars and horses outside the Longjian pavilion. The literati and poets entered the high-rise building covering half of the street under the hospitality of the steward, and the voice of young master, brother, could not be heard. Longjian pavilion occupies a huge area, with the east, west, south, north, and middle floors facing each other. Although there are also Qing courthouses performing arts in it, it is not considered a brothel. There are many kinds of calligraphy, painting, music, chess, wine, tea, opera, etc. There is only one thing inside and outside. Yeah, word. The new year is approaching, and there were not many entertainment activities in ancient times. Martial arts competitions and literati poetry battles have become the biggest highlights in Chang'an City. Longjian Pavilion is the most famous gold-selling kill in Daifang. It held a poetry meeting in line with current affairs, so it couldn't be petty. Not only did it invite several great scholars from Chang'an City to serve as judges, but it also took out a sword as the prize. The name of the sword was Shangchun Daio, relied on martial arts to rejuvenate the country. Warriors and weapons are inseparable, and the sword is the gentleman in the military. No matter whether he is a scholar or a warrior, he will hang a sword, which is the same as a gentleman never leaves his body. The sword Shangchun is considered a famous sword in the world. Its previous owner was a female knight from Shu. She was killed by the detective division 10 years ago. The sword entered the treasury and was eventually sold to a wealthy businessman. After many twists and turns, it fell into Longjian Pavilion and reappeared today. At dusk, Su Buling arrived at Longjian Pavilion in a carriage. Snowflakes were flying outside the building, and there were many people dressed as warriors coming in and out. Because there were many nobles coming, the detective department sent 60 wolf guards from the Tianshao and Tianjian battalions to patrol the surrounding areas. The wolf guards usually worked in teams of 3. Such a large formation was already exaggerated in Chang'an City. Su Buling stepped out of the carriage, tightened the white fox shawl tightly around his body, and 8 palace guards drove away the crowded crowd. There was a steward outside Longyean Pavilion welcoming guests. He looked up and saw Su Buling. Although he had never seen him before, he saw the sign of Prince Su's mansion on the carriage and guessed his identity. He quickly stepped forward slowly and raised his hand to salute. "Prince Su is here. If you are a little disappointed, please come in quickly." When the bustling crowd heard this, they all turned around to check. The roads moved out of the way, and many ladies and ladies whispered, "Is this Prince Su's crown Prince Su Buling?" "That's right. He's so handsome that no one else can be found in Chang'an City. No wonder everyone who has met Prince Su can never forget him. The eyes are really beautiful, more beautiful than my daughter's." Su Buling frowned slightly, feeling like he was being looked at like a monkey, so he could only quickly enter Longyean Pavilion. "Oh, His Royal Highness is still shy. Prince Su rarely goes out, and he has a good reputation. He is different from those playboys, he just has a bad temper. Men should be more tempered. Look at those powerless scholars. What kind of men are they? Dayo used martial arts to rejuvenate the country, and most of the women were aggressive." With Su Buling's identity here, he couldn't stop chatting with these ladies and ladies. At the moment, he could only pretend that he didn't hear them. Among the crowd, a woman wearing a bamboo hat looked a little surprised in her eyes when she saw Su Buling, whom she had met once before, enter the Longyean Pavilion. After the woman swept the wolf guard outside Longyean Pavilion, she quietly disappeared into the dusk. The light of the glazed lamps shines under the eaves of the building. In the hall of the main building of Longyean Pavilion, dozens of book desks are arranged in a circle. Confucian scholars in robes sit at the top. King Yan Songyu and the Great Sacrifice wine song baking are all there. In Song Yufu stood behind her father, tiptoeing and kept searching in the crowd. It wasn't until Su Buling's figure walked into the hall that she secretly breathed a sigh of relief, with a bit of impatience in her eyes. There were many students in the hall, and from time to time someone would hand over a poem draft to Xiao Si. If a masterpiece came out, a great scholar would read it out on the spot. Su Buling entered the hall without deliberately attracting attention. After handing the poem manuscript to Xiao Si, he went to his seat in the hall to drink tea and wait. However, Su Buletinling rarely arrived, and there were many people coming to say hello. Not long after he sat down, Xiao Ting, who had been severely beaten, swung his fan in the middle of the winter, walked over and sat down, and said with a chuckle, "Oh no, why are you free to come here today? Xiao Ting's elder brother is Mrs. Lu's late husband, so it's okay to directly refer to himself as an elder." Su Buling twirled the teacup with his slender fingers and squinted slightly. "Looking for a fight?" Xiao Ting shook his fan and said confidently, "Today's dragon poetry recital is an elegant place, but it's too rude to do anything. Cha." Before he finished speaking, Su Buling patted the small case at hand, and the porcelain lid of the teacup bounced up. He patted it with his left hand, and the porcelain lid flew out with the sound of breaking wind. The white jade fan bone in Xiao Ting's hand broke with the sound, and the lid of the cup flew half of the hall and hit Gongsun Lu, who was talking to someone, on the back of the head. Next to Gongsun Lu was a middle-aged man with a knife. His eyes were reserved and his ears moved slightly without looking back. He clamped the fast-moving porcelain cover between his fingers without making any sound. The middle-aged man with the knife looked back and saw that it was Su Buling who had taken action. He nodded slightly and flicked his fingers. The porcelain cover silently passed through the gap between the crowds and landed on Su Buling's hand. On the teacup, it fits perfectly. Su Buling frowned, looked at the intact teacup at hand, and asked, "Who is that middle-aged man with the knife?" Xiao Ting shook his bare fan bone and raised his head to take a look. "Zhang Xiang, the commander of the Criminal Investigation Department, is nicknamed the Massacre." Su Buling was a little surprised. He rarely went out this year, and even the prince's children were rarely seen, let alone officials. However, the name 10,000 Massacres is quite striking. 10 years ago, the detective department cleared out the underworld forces, and the leader in public was Zhang Xiang. At that time, the underworld catastrophe involved almost all the forces of the Dayu dynasty, and even the death of Princess Su was related to this matter. There must be more than one master who participated in the hunting and killing at that time, but Zhang Xiang could be the leader in public, and his status and martial arts were absolutely transcendent. He loved knives like crazy, and 10 years ago, he was famous for his superb 8 diagrams knife. Su Buling looked at Zhang Xiang for a few times, and couldn't see anything special, so he lost interest and turned his eyes to the top of the hall, waiting for the main show to begin. Xiaoting was beaten up in the school last time, and he still couldn't get back the place. Seeing Su Buling asking Zhang Xiang, he began to be sarcastic. Su Buling, this poetry meeting is full of literati. If you are bored, I will go and tell Lord Zhang, and you two can have a competition here. The meaning naturally implies that Su Buling is a rough man with well-developed limbs. Su Buling frowned slightly when he heard this ridicule. Can't I come here to write poems and be a writer? Xiaoting was stunned, quite surprised. He looked around for a few times, no one noticed, and suddenly moved closer. Buling, you also bought poems today to join in the fun. Su Buling's eyes were calm. Why? No. Xiaoting looked like a fellow traveler and nodded. I thought you didn't like this. Yes, with your words, I recognize you as my nephew. Bang. In the noisy hall, a barely audible muffled sound came out. Many people frowned and tilted their heads, and after taking a look, they pretended nothing happened. Su Buling drank tea slowly. Xiaoting climbed up from the ground with difficulty, rubbed his forehead, raised his hand and nodded at Su Buling, his eyes full of anger. You are so cruel. He waved his sleeves and sat beside him without saying anything. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 13. The ladies smiled sweetly, and the talented scholars were full of vigor and vigor. In the hall of Longjian Pavilion, hundreds of literati were bustling and eloquent, and every 3 sentences they said would quote classics. No matter whether others understood or not, they had to nod and smile, looking like fellow travelers. On the upper row of armchairs, Song Baking, with gray hair, held a teacup, with a little impatience in his eyes. As the chief priest of the Imperial College, students who graduated from the Imperial College basically had to call him Mr., and those who became officials were all over Dayu, and his students were all over the world. He really looked down on this trick of pursuing fame and fortune. However, the status of warriors in Dayu was too high, and the literati could no longer suppress it. The current emperor attached great importance to literati. If these were not done, Chang'an City would probably be full of martial arts and swordplay, and fighting and killing would really damage the dignity of the Central Plains dynasty. So Song Baking still had to come to such occasions, and when he met a few talented literati, he had to speak a few words of praise. The emperor of the day would also pay attention to it, and even study poetry quite a bit. However, poetry is something that anyone who has read books and learned the rules of poetry can write, but it takes several years or decades for a poem to be passed down. In a poetry meeting, there are probably only 1 or 2 poems that are worth reading, and the rest are all dross. Therefore, the review of manuscripts was handed over to the good daughter Song Yufu. At this time, next to the desk where many great scholars were sitting, King Song Yu of Yan and Song Baking were discussing the matter of the next spring examination. Song Yufu was looking at the manuscript seriously, and from time to time she asked a few words from a gray-haired old man next to her. The old man's name was Qi Xinggan. When he was young, his Chang'an Fu was valued by the previous emperor. He was famous in the capital and entered the officialdom. He served as an imperial censor and was well known in the capital for his erudition and talent. Of course, Qi Xing'an was more famous for his stubbornness. During the previous emperor's more than 20 years in office, Qi Xing'an died and made more than 20 remonstrations, which made the previous emperor so angry that he opened his mouth and scolded him as Qi Laofu. The current emperor has been in power for 10 years. He has rectified the administration of officials, quelled banditry, and valued the poor. No matter how you look at it, he deserves to be the king of the revival. However, because he forgot the time when playing chess with someone and came to the court half a quarter of an hour late, Qi Xing'an chased and bit him. To this day, he still talks about it and reminds the current emperor not to indulge in pleasure. As a result, the current emperor was annoyed and even gave up entertainment activities such as hunting and spring outing. Qi Xing'an is not afraid of those who wear shoes when barefoot. He is really willing to cut himself off. Even many great scholars who are also literati are absolutely overcorrecting, but they can't argue with Qi Xing'an, which shows his ability. However, although Qi Xing'an likes to be serious, his attainments in poetry are still obvious to all. At this time, he took a pile of messy poems and read them word by word. His evaluation was also very pertinent, and basically no one disagreed. Seeing that the poetry meeting was halfway through, several good poems were produced during the period, but they were not masterpieces that could be passed down to future generations. Song Yufu was a little impatient, but she hadn't found the poem she had heard in the Imperial College, so she could only keep looking at other people's desks. Song Baking was communicating with the king of Yan. Seeing his daughter looking around without any manners, he said with a little displeasure, "Yufu, what are you looking at?" Song Yufu quickly shrank her neck, did her job properly, and responded softly, "Daddy, I didn't see anything." The king of Yan was easygoing and elegant. Seeing Song Baking being so strict with his daughter, he smiled and said, "Yufu is not old, it's normal for her to like poetry and songs. There has been no good work for several years, but the dregs are everywhere. I'm afraid she is tired of reading them." Song Baking nodding, he looked at the handsome man and beautiful woman who were full of vigor and vitality below him. Poetry is written from feelings. How can a young person who pretends to be sad about the passing of spring and autumn write a good article? While speaking, Qi Xing'an, who was sitting next to him, shook his head and continued, "That's not necessarily true. There are millions of households in Chang'an City, and there are many people who are proficient in literature and writing. There are always a few people with outstanding talents, such as this one. The wind has stopped, the dust has smelled, and the flowers have faded. I am tired of combing my hair at night." As soon as the voice came out, 7 or 8 old Confucian scholars with frowns on their faces turned their heads away. After reading doggerel like a river is 100 feet wide, and the fish in it are tender and fresh for half a night, a sentence "the wind has stopped, the dust has smelled, and the flowers have faded" suddenly popped up. It felt like washing my ears, and it was hard not to pay attention. Yan Wang and Song Baking also raised their eyebrows slightly, and looked at Qi Xing'an with a little more seriousness. Qi Xing'an was over 60 years old, too old. After reciting 2 lines, he felt that his appearance was not appropriate, so he handed the manuscript to the servant and passed it to the singing girl who was playing the piano next to him. Hundreds of talented men and beautiful women present saw the scene and knew that someone was going to be in the limelight, so they all stopped talking and turned their heads to check. The brothel singing girl, who was dressed in gorgeous clothes, relied on this to improve her reputation. After receiving the manuscript, she stood up, read it carefully, and then spoke softly. "The wind has stopped, the dust has smelled, the flowers have withered, and I am tired of combing my hair at night. Things are different, people are different, and everything is over. I want to speak, but tears flow first." The delicate voice is gentle, and there is a little sadness, which fully reflects the sadness of the prosperity has ended, things are different, and people are different. Just a few words can make people imagine the exhaustion and misery of a woman who has experienced the ups and downs of life. Song Baking's eyes lit up, and he sat upright and listened carefully. The king of Yan did not change his expression, but tapped the table with his hand and nodded slowly. Not to mention the many talented men and beautiful women present, just the 2 short lines in the first stanza show the extraordinary skill of this woman in her words and sentences. Her artistic conception is even more unmatched. Many young ladies and wives of officials stared at the singer. The singer looked serious and continued. I heard that Zhuangzi is still beautiful in spring, and I also plan to go boating. I'm just afraid that Zhuangzi's small boat can't carry so much sorrow. After the whole poem came out, the scene was quiet for a long time. Song Baking stroked his beard, frowned and nodded slowly, brewing for a long time, but couldn't pick a suitable word to comment. The word Shankai vividly displays the image of a weather-beaten woman, while Zayaki describes that after a woman has gone through the storm, life must continue. I heard that the spring scenery over Shuangzi is quite good, maybe you can go there to relax. But a lonely boat may not be able to carry the sorrow and resentment in my heart. Both the words and techniques are exquisite, and the sad emotion in the words is even more touching. The whole poem is gentle and mournful, which makes people feel like seeing the person and hearing the voice when reading it. It is worthy of being an eternal song. The celebrities and scholars present felt that they did not have the skills to write it down, so how could they dare to make rash comments? King Yan Songyu frowned and thought for a long time, then smiled and looked at the talented man and beautiful lady below. I didn't expect that there would be such a strange woman hidden in the poetry society. It's really unfair to be unknown. Yes. Qi Xinggan touched his chin, with a bit of sadness in his eyes. Based on this poem alone, I can ask the Holy One to give this lady a safe and comfortable place to live. My Dayu attaches great importance to poor families, regardless of civil or military status, regardless of gender. How can we let people with such true talents be so full of sorrow and resentment that they don't even have a place to relax? Although Song Baking doesn't think that being able to write poems will make him a good parent official, but if he can write poems so well, he must be talented and knowledgeable. At that moment, he nodded slightly. That makes sense. Which lady wrote this poem? The talented and beautiful women in the hall looked around, obviously looking for the gentle woman in the poem who was half-aged and full of sorrow. The singer looked at the signature of the poem, hesitated for a long time, and then said uncertainly. Su Bulletin Ling, MRS Su. There will be an update soon. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 14. MRS Su. As the singer announced her name, the hall of Longjian Pavilion became quiet for a while. The talented scholars all frowned slightly, obviously they had never heard of this strange woman. Song Baking blinked and looked at the singer in the distance suspiciously. After confirming that she had read it correctly, he was a little confused and turned his eyes back to the many talented women below. Bulletin Ling seeing this name, is the same as the name of Prince Su. Who is this MRS Bulletin Ling? When everyone heard this, they all looked to the side with strange eyes. It is not uncommon for a man and a woman to have the same name, but it is also an interesting story. What everyone didn't expect was that Prince Su, who was sitting next to the hall drinking tea, stood up and tightened his fox fur coat. His eyes were arrogant and he was proud from the bottom of his heart. Yes, it's me. Puff. Xiaoting, who was sitting next to Su Bulletin Ling, sprayed a mouthful of tea when he heard it. Patting his chest, he felt a little uncomfortable. Su Buling, you made me laugh to death, ha ha ha. Xiaoting was the only one laughing in the whole audience, while everyone else was silent, with eyes full of astonishment and confusion. Xiaoting was a rich kid, rich but not stupid, and he knew his own weight. He couldn't possibly buy such a famous poem. Even if he wanted to show off, he should at least buy a man's poem, which would be a bit easier to get away with. This was obviously a poem written by a weathered woman, and it came from the pen of a prince of a vassal state, and it was also tired of combing my hair at night, and also planning to go boating. This kind of sissy behavior, is it something that the son of a vassal state would do? Songbaking and others knew that Su Buling was an excellent martial artist, but not good at writing, but they didn't expect that Su Buling couldn't even copy poems. What's the difference between this and copying the name on the test paper in the Imperial College exam? The whole place was silent for a long time. If it weren't for Su Buling's identity, many talented men and beautiful women would have started to sneer and ridicule him. Poetry gatherings are places of elegance. It is shameful for the sons of princes to buy poems. It may have been a small trick to gain fame in the past, but it is the first time in the world that it is so blatant. Yan Wang Songyu rubbed his forehead and thought for a long time, but he didn't know what to say. Songbaking, as the chief priest of the Imperial Academy and Su Buling's teacher, was arrogant and proud, but his face turned red at this time. A row of tables. Su Buling. As the Prince of Suwang, you should focus on the government and the army. Why come to the poetry gathering to join in the fun? This was to tell Su Buling to get out quickly and not embarrass himself. It was a way to give him a way out. But Su Buling came here today just to get scolded. Su Buling pretended to be unrepentant, walked to the center of the hall, spread his hands and looked around. Anyone can enter the poetry meeting. I wrote a good poem. Why can't I come? You wrote a good poem. The talented men and beautiful women in the audience were almost suffocated by the sentence. They used great willpower to not curse. There were hundreds of people present, and they were not blind. Who can't see that this poem was written by a weathered and downtrodden female poet? You, Su Buling, are the Prince of Suwang, a genius of the generation. The only thing you have to do with weathered and downtrodden female poet is probably the word of. If you want to buy poems and copy poems, at least copy a reliable one. This look must have been tricked by the female poet and he didn't know it. Buying poems was pointed out in court, but it would be a fate of eternal infamy. It is reasonable for Su Buling to refuse to admit that he wrote it. But Songbaking gave him a way out and insisted on jumping out to be a target, which is too ungrateful. Do you really think that no one dares to speak because he is the eldest son of Prince Su? Behind the desk, Chi Xinggan, who always had a bad temper, slammed the table and stood up, saying angrily. Nonsense, do you think that everyone here is a 3-year-old who can't read? If this poem was written by you, could it be that you have been dressed as a man for so many years? Ha ha ha. There was constant laughter at the scene, and many young ladies from official families secretly glanced at Su Buling, who was wearing fox fur, and whispered secretly, he looks more beautiful than a woman, maybe he is dressed as a man. Chi Xinggan's face froze as soon as he said this, and he looked at Su Buling carefully for a few times, as if to confirm whether it was a man or a woman. Yan Wang Songyu looked very strange, and raised his hand. Buling is a man, this poem, He hummed for a long time, and didn't know how to say it without hurting feelings. Laughter continued in the hall. Seeing that the situation was about to get heated, Su Buling naturally blushed and said stubbornly. This poem was written by this prince, you are not allowed to laugh. Shut up. Chi Xinggan had never seen such an unrepentant student, and he slammed the table and said angrily. You said you wrote it, who can prove it? Su Buling was speechless for a moment, pretending to be speechless, looking away, as if he did not admit to copying the poem. Chi Xinggan was furious when he saw this, and slammed the table again. Who can prove it? Su Buling was still speechless. Just as everyone was laughing at the joke, a righteous voice suddenly sounded on the high platform. I can prove it. The hall suddenly became quiet. Su Buling's unrepentant face froze. The hall of Longian Pavilion, which was full of lights and bustling, became silent as this weak voice of justice sounded. Everyone turned their eyes to the high platform where the great scholars were sitting, and saw a gentle woman standing there upright with a bit of anger in her eyes. It was obvious that she felt that the scholars present should not insult her innocence. Song Baking frowned. "Yufu, what are you proving?" Song Yufu bowed with a proper manner, facing the many talented men and beautiful women who were paying attention to her. "This poem was originally written by Su Shizi, but I don't want to argue with you for fame. You shouldn't judge a gentleman by your own mean heart." The talented men and beautiful women present looked around, not knowing how to explain to this girl. I'm afraid she was a young lady who was dazzled by Su Shizi's beauty and made a fuss without considering the situation. Could they not understand whether Su Buling copied it? And the protagonist of this incident, Su Buling, looked at Chen Yaojin, who came out halfway with fear, and wanted to go up and kill him. It was not easy to get the name of stealing poems, and it seemed that the task was about to be completed. "Why did you come out to join in the fun?" Qi Xinggan frowned when he saw Song Yufu raise objections and said, "Tolerating and shielding him ruins his reputation. How can you prove it for him?" Song Yufu was fearless and was about to reveal all of Su Buling's past to prove that Su Buling was not a reckless man with strong limbs and a simple mind, but a great talent who was skilled in both civil and military affairs, mature at a young age, very cunning, and with unlimited prospects. However, Su Buling was very good at observing people's words and expressions. Seeing Song Yufu's appearance, he knew that she had caught his handle. He made a quick decision and stepped forward and said, "Forget it. Miss Song spoke for justice, and I am grateful to her, but I did copy this poem, and I dare not jeopardize her reputation. The prince is very fierce." Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 15. Wow! When Su Buling said this, the whole place was filled with astonishment. There was nothing that people could do if he refused to change his words after copying the poem. If he admitted it on the spot, he would be labeled as a poem thief. However, although everyone was ashamed, Su Buling was brave enough to admit it openly, so there was nothing to say. He was the eldest son of Prince Su, and he bought a poem for fun. He admitted it on the spot after being exposed. He could let it go. He didn't make a living from it, so there was no need to hold on to it. Song Baking, Qi Xinggan and other great scholars were relieved and nodded slightly when they saw Su Buling admit his mistake cleanly. Qi Xinggan was about to say it is great to know one's mistakes and improve them, but she didn't expect Miss Song next to her to speak again. Song Yufu's face was full of anger and confusion, her almond eyes were wide open. "Master Su, this poem was originally written by you, why don't you admit it, and still bear the infamy of poetry theft?" "Because I don't want to die young." Su Buling gritted his teeth in his heart, and he had to look ashamed, shaking his head and chuckled. "This poem is obvious to all. I can't write it. It is indeed copied." Song Yufu's eyes glared. "Who did you copy?" "I." Su Buling's heart stomped and froze on the spot. "It's over. Who did I copy?" "I copied Li Qingzhao." "There is no Li Qingzhao in this place." Su Buling's face sank slightly, and his mind turned quickly. "Well, I asked the servants to go out and buy it." But no one listened to the sentence. Song Yufu's words, "Who did you copy?" had attracted the attention of everyone present. Yes. Su Buling's literary talent may be fake, but the poem is real. This poem will surely become a masterpiece of all ages. Even if Su Buling bought it, it must have been written by someone with real talent, right? Buying and selling, there is buying only when there is selling. Just now, I only accused Su Buling of stealing poems, but I forgot about this. Qi Xinggan, who has always been picky, frowned and touched his chin and said, "Su Buling, since you said that this poem was bought, then may I ask who bought it?" Su Buling took a breath. "I asked the servant to go out and buy it, I don't know who it was. When did you buy it? A few days ago. Okay. Qi Xing'an nodded. The great scholars on the high platform are not corrupt scholars. Who hasn't been struggling in the officialdom for half a lifetime? Hearing these words, everyone showed a strange expression. Qi Xing'an walked down the platform to the hall with a smile on his face. He put his hands behind his back like a teacher and circled around Su Buling twice. A few days ago, that is to say, this poem was bought near Chang'an City, right? Su Buling frowned. I guess so. He. Qi Xing'an looked at Su Buling for a few times. Among the 1 million people in Chang'an City, half of them have studied in private schools, and only 30% of them are proficient in literature and writing, and I am afraid that less than 10% understand poetry, right? The many talented people present nodded. Chang'an City is the capital of the country. There are many people who can recite poems and write couplets in Beijing, but in the central Chang'an, it is only a small circle. Qi Xing'an chuckled. 80% of these people are candidates and scholars, and the rest are talented and wandering. You should know how many women there are among them. Everyone nodded repeatedly. Women cannot enter the government as officials. There are many who are proficient in literature and poetry, but few have high attainments. There are only a handful of women in Chang'an who can be called talented women. Qi Xing'an circled around Su Buling. From the artistic conception of this poem, it is about a woman who is a little older and has gone through a setback. Things have changed and everything has come to an end. Well, she may be a widow at home, and the accomplishments of this poem are obvious to all. With such talent, it is impossible for her to remain unknown. I thought about it, and there is no woman in Chang'an who has such an experience and such talent. Yes. There is indeed no such woman in Chang'an. If there was, she would have been famous a long time ago. The whole place was whispering, and they were also confused. Su Buling looked around, spread his hands and said helplessly, I am a man, only 18 years old, in a high position, and it is even more impossible for me to write this poem. Qi Xing'an curled his lips, showing some relief. You are young, but you are modest and do not seek fame. This kind of heart is not easy. Just now, I was judging you by my own mean heart. Su Buling was puzzled. You can't find anyone else, so you think I wrote it? Why? Qi Xing'an laughed. Prince Su didn't have this experience, but Madame Lu was a widow at home and has been taking care of His Highness. It's not surprising that His Highness was inspired to write this poem. Wow! The whole audience was in an uproar. There were many princes and nobles present, and many of them knew about this matter. If you think about it carefully, it is really possible. Su Buling was stunned. He didn't expect this old man to have such a rich imagination. He raised his hand and said, This poem is not written by Madame Lu, I bought it, sir, please don't guess. Qi Xing'an put his hands behind his back, with a little relief. It's a good thing for young people not to argue, but Master Su shouldn't hide it so deeply. Since you said you bought it, then tell me who you asked to buy this poem. Su Buling opened his mouth. It said that it was bought by a servant, anonymously, and I don't know who the seller is. Qi Xing'an sighed. It doesn't matter if Master Su doesn't admit it, justice is in the hearts of the people, everyone present is a scholar, and they know what the situation is. Yes, yes. Mr. Qi is right. It's done. The more you apply it, the whiter it becomes. Su Buling couldn't argue, so he could only spread his hands and said, believe it or not. He turned around and prepared to run away. On the high platform, Song Yufu saw that Su Buling was about to leave, so she hurriedly ran forward a few steps. Wait. I haven't finished proving it yet. I also have other poems written by Prince Su. I read The Sword while drunk. Are you done yet? Su Buling was furious, and he rose up like a falcon, hunting with fox fur, and landed directly on the high platform. He raised his hand to cover Song Yufu's mouth, and lifted the impatient Song girl. Buletin rushed out of the window and disappeared into the hall. The whole audience was shocked. When many official ladies saw this miraculous skill, stars almost appeared in their eyes. Prince Su is both civilized and military, and he is so handsome. He really doesn't give other men a way to survive. Yes, it's really rare for a man to understand women so well. If I were Mrs. Lu, my heart would melt. They must have been affectionate with many nymphomaniacs. The few great scholars on the high platform were looking around with a bit of astonishment in their eyes. I didn't expect that Prince Su, who was famous for his violent impulse, would have such a good literary talent. King Yan Songyu tapped his fingers on the table, thought for a while, and chuckled. Looking at the sword while drunk, if you don't let this kid, he hides it a little deep. Song Baking frowned, thought for a moment, shook his head and said. What Lao Chi said is reasonable, but Su Buling is only 18 years old. No matter how good his literary talent is, it is difficult for him to write this poem. And there is no need to deny that there may be other hidden reasons. Before making a final conclusion, it is better not to be blind. Good spread. This can be regarded as a questionable ending. But so many people present have brains and ears. Some people believe it and some don't. No one knows. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 16. Night. Xiao xiao snowflakes fell among the verandas and pavilions of Longjian Pavilion. The lanterns at the corners of the eaves emitted a dim light. A few literary ladies who had not entered the attic were chatting under the maple trees with fallen leaves. There were noisy carriages and horses on the streets. The sound came, making the tranquility outside the attic even more apparent. The windows of the towering high-rise buildings are exposed, and the corners of the courtyard walls facing the street are visible. Song Yufu, who was wearing a furry coat and skirt, leaned against the corner of the wall with her hands on her chest. She was not short, but the man who blocked her in the corner was so tall that he could only look up his little face and his almond-shaped eyes. There was a bit of nervousness, but more of an unconvinced feeling of I'm right. The fox fur on Su Buling's body was covered with a few bits of flying snow, and there was a hint of irritation on his handsome face. Is there something wrong with you? Did I provoke you? It's natural for Su Buling to be angry. He followed Mrs. Lu's instructions and came here to buy poems and defile himself. He racked his brains to bring out all Li Qingzhao's poems. In the end, he was messed up by Song Yufu. Can he not be angry? Judging from the current situation, most people in the building thought that he wrote "The wind lives in the dust and the fragrant flowers are gone" for Mrs. Lu. He was left speechless and could not explain it. There may be some random gossip tomorrow morning. And his reputation as a friend of women is probably well established. Where can a gentle and talented man who understands his daughter's thoughts find a second one? When this matter reaches Mrs. Lu's ears tomorrow, Su Buling can already imagine the outcome, mourning his misfortune, hating his inability to fight. You can even pretend to be a pig, and you can pretend to be a gentle and talented person. What's the use of you? But Song Yufu obviously didn't know this. As a woman from a scholarly family, her reputation has always been more important than her life. Yes, that's right. She won't lower her head even if she doesn't want it. This is called the character of a scholar. Facing the cold-faced Su Buling, Song Yufu was not afraid at all, but said seriously. Su Shizi, why are you so mean to me? You have real talent and knowledge, but you don't want to waste time explaining to those people. As the saying goes, a heap of bones is destroyed, and a crowd of words makes gold. If you don't explain it, it will become true as time goes by. I helped you clear your name, you should thank me. Ha, thank you, Su Buling raised his hand to strike. Song Yufu retracted her face into the furry collar, turned her face slightly, and still spoke sharply. You are a gentleman, and hitting a woman is unbecoming of a gentleman, so you don't hit me, you just scare me. I have already seen it. Doesn't this mean I am weak and I am justified? Su Buring nodded, broke a branch from the bush next to him, and walked to Song Yufu. Hand out. Song Yufu quickly hid her hands behind her waist and leaned against the wall stubbornly. You can't hit me. The rule is to correct mistakes. I'm not wrong. You can't hit people without reason. Even if you want to hit me, you have to tell me where I went wrong first, otherwise I won't change it and I will dare to do it next time. With Song Yufu's literary temperament, it is estimated that in order to clear his name, he can spread the news that he is a great talent everywhere. Su Buling's eyes were slightly cold. Don't interfere in my affairs from now on. Once a teacher, always a father. If you call my father sir, I have to take care of it. This is also for my father's reputation. Song Yufu leaned against the wall and refused to lower her head. Su Buling frowned slightly, thought for a moment, and said coldly. If a tree is beautiful in the forest, the wind will destroy it. Do you understand this truth? Song Yufu nodded. I am the eldest son of King Yan. I am the eldest son of 12 states. I have 200,000 cavalry in my hand. I have been gifted with martial arts since I was a child. Am I not considered to be the best in the forest? Song Yufu thought for a while, slowly came back to her senses, and her eyes lit up. Is Prince Su trying to hide his clumsiness? Su Buling breathed a sigh of relief and said with a straight face, now do you know where you went wrong? Song Yufu nodded weakly, but quickly frowned and whispered. Is there anyone like you who is a clumsy person? You are desecrating yourself by buying poems. The point is buying poems. You write a poem yourself and pretend that you bought it? I didn't write it. Su Buling raised the small branch in his hand and said in a deep voice, I'm not a widow, how can I write such words? Song Yufu said oh and narrowed her eyes slightly. It turns out that this is really written for Madame Lu. His Highness the Crown Prince actually has a heart with 7 orifices. Su Buletinling's eyes turned cold. He raised his hand and grabbed Song Yufu's sleeve, pulled her out a little, and slapped her buttocks with the small branch in his hand. I asked you to be stubborn, you deserve a beating, right? Song Yufu screamed in surprise. It didn't hurt even though she was wearing thick clothes in winter, but her daughter's family had a habit of being spanked by men. She was already 16. Song Yufu's eyes were filled with a bit of embarrassment, but she didn't dare to fight back, so she hurriedly stretched out her hand. It's not okay there, to fight, thugs. Su Buling used a small branch to slap her little hand, but the force was not very strong. Song Yufu frowned and didn't hide. It was obvious that she was used to being slapped on the hand by adults when she was a child. Su Buletinling gave a symbolic slap twice and threw the twig aside. As long as you admit your mistake, don't go around spreading the word that I am a gentleman and a talented person. If you let me hear the slightest bit of news, I have plenty of ways to deal with you. Song Yufu retracted her hands into her sleeves, her face turned a little red, and she muttered with her little hands. You can tell my dad no. No. Then I am the only one in the entire Chang'an city who knows that you are a man of both civil and military skills, a deep city, young and mature. As Song Yufu was talking, she noticed that Su Buling's eyes were getting colder. She quickly shut up and thought for a while. I'll keep it a secret for you. Su Buling squinted his eyes and looked at her up and down, not sure if this girl would sell him out right away. Just in case, he raised his hand and pulled the hairpin off her head. The hairpin was made of white jade, without too many carvings. It only had the 8 characters the bright moon shines on the pine, the lotus is like jade engraved on it. The handwriting was as sharp as gold hooks and iron strokes, and it was definitely made by a famous artist. Song Yufu was startled and raised her hand to grab it in a hurry. Su Shizi, give me back my hairpin. This is the hairpin my mother left for me. Su Buling turned his palm slightly, and the hairpin fell into his sleeve. I will return it to you when I leave Beijing. If you go out and say something, Song Yufu was a little anxious. She raised her hand to take the hairpin back, but she didn't dare to put her hand into the man's clothes and touch it randomly. She was so anxious that she tiptoed on the spot. No, a girl's hairpin can't be given to others. I promise not to say anything. Su Buling snorted lightly. It's good that you know you are anxious. I don't need a hairpin. I will keep my mouth shut and return it to you. Song Yufu had no choice but to give up the idea of snatching it back. After hesitating for a moment, she whispered, I promise not to say anything. Don't lose the hairpin. Also, the poem was read from a rare collection of poems in the palace, not written by me. Song Yufu nodded quickly, pretending to understand. I understand. Su Buling acted fiercely. A gentleman's word is as good as his bond. If you cause me trouble again, I will strip you naked and hang you up to beat you. Song Yufu blushed and pursed her lips. Su Shizi, you are the son of a prince, a body worth 1,000 gold. How can you say such words that only a pervert would say? I won't cause you trouble. While speaking, a commotion suddenly came from the street in the distance. There is an assassin. It's the person from last time, catch her quickly. The sound of official swords being unsheathed came one after another, and dozens of wolf guards appeared in an instant on the buildings near Longjian Pavilion, chasing in the southeast direction. Song Yufu was shocked. She knew that Zhang Xiang, the commander of the investigation department, was assassinated last time, but she didn't expect that this assassin would appear again. Song Yufu turned around quickly, trying to pull Su Buling to hide in front of the guards, but when she looked around, she saw only two shallow footprints on the snow beside the wall, and there was no figure. Huh? Where is the person? The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 17. Longjian Pavilion is backed by the small street between the two buildings. Snowflakes are falling and there is no moonlight, and the street is dim and dark. Su Buling flew over the wall and landed on the street. When he raised his eyes, he saw the light of swords in the distance. A man in black clothes and a bamboo hat, holding a dark blue sword, fought with 6 wolf guards from the emperor's camp. The walls and roofs collapsed from time to time, causing many residents to scream. Old Xiao held his cane and raised and lowered it a few times on the wall before landing firmly in front of Su Buling, frowning. This man is very skilled in martial arts. His swordsmanship looks like a sword from the Tang family, but it has its own shape but not its meaning. He seems to have learned it secretly. I am afraid he is a Jianghu person who came here to seek revenge. Su Buling nodded slightly, not surprised that an assassin appeared in the capital. The late emperor died of illness 10 years ago, and the Prince Songji inherited the throne. Because Dail used martial arts to rejuvenate the country, over the past 200 years, countless aristocratic families and sects have been born. Even the imperial capital Chang'an City has many martial arts schools. The inheritance of incense and grievances and loyalty have connected various forces into a large network, and its influence is no less than that of the noble clans that once controlled the government. If there are too many people practicing martial arts, there will inevitably be those who take desperate measures. Incidents of burning, killing, looting, and using force to violate the prohibition are endless. Remote states and counties have even become the private territories of some aristocratic sects, which is like a state within a state. After Songji succeeded to the throne, the first thing he did was to purge the Jianghu forces, forcing several big families in the Jianghu to obey the orders of the Criminal Investigation Department, and each sent their masters to clean up those who refused to obey the rules, which was known as the Iron Eagle hunting deer in history. The original intention of Iron Eagle hunting deer is obviously good. It is to support the established aristocratic families, suppress the small forces that dominate the world, and guide the warriors to develop in a direction that is beneficial to the court. It is probably to acquire literary and martial arts and repay the favor, the meaning of emperor's house. But the court obviously miscalculated the reaction of the Jianghu people. The biggest difference between warriors and literati is that they have a sword in their hearts. When an ordinary man is angry, his steps are nothing more than blood splattering. He is suppressed by the imperial court and has many resistors. Over the course of hundreds of years, various large and small forces will inevitably be involved in unclear grievances and grudges. The aristocratic families who obey the imperial court will crusade against the Jianghu forces, some of which are not easy to do, and some of which are public and private. In just 1 year, things have reached a point where it is difficult to end, and there are even signs of an uprising. One can imagine the outcome of the emperor's anger. The 7 kings quickly received the imperial order and dispatched more than 800,000 troops to sweep across the Yu dynasty, almost breaking the backbone of the warriors. Princess Su was born in the Lu family of the East China Sea, and she was of the same lineage as the Lu family of Jinling thousands of years ago. She was a powerful figure in the Central Plains dynasty for a long time, both in culture and in military affairs. The Lu family of Donghai had a disagreement at that time. They felt that the imperial court acted excessively and did not obey orders, which led to an encirclement and suppression by the Ziliang cavalry. After a great battle, the then head of the Lu family died. Concubine Su died in depression, and Prince Su has not renewed her relationship, which is all related to this incident. Even the kings with different surnames sitting in the 12 states were affected to this point. One can imagine how tragic the world was at that time. 10 years have passed, and there has been an endless stream of people coming to Beijing for revenge. Almost every year, more than 100 people die silently at the hands of the Wolf Guard. Su Buling looked at it for a moment, but he couldn't tell which faction the woman in black belonged to. He only knew that she was very skilled and asked softly, "Zhang Xiang is dead." Lao Xiao shook his head. "Zhang Xiang is in charge of the criminal investigation department. He will not die so easily. The assassination attempt just now was noticed by Zhang Xiang and he was slapped. I'm afraid I won't be able to escape." Su Buletinling nodded. He wanted to go into the archives to inquire about the information. Zhang Xiang was in charge of the archives himself. He was thinking about whether this assassin could be of use when a shout suddenly came from the distance. "Get out of the way. Your Highness, be careful." Su Buling was stunned for a moment, looked up and saw that the assassin in black was charging towards him with a sword in hand. Lao Xiao narrowed his eyes slightly and said loudly, "This kid has so little eyesight that he treats His Highness as a soft persimmon." Lao Xiao said and was about to step forward, but Su Buling gently raised his hand to stop him, and then made a look of horror in his eyes. "Escort." The cold wind howled. The black-clothed assassin held a long sword and retreated steadily under the attacks of the hook, sickle spear, and wild goose feather knife. Just then, he failed to assassinate him. He was hit by Zhang Xiang's palm in the back. His thin lips turned black and blue, and his steps gradually became unsteady. Seeing that more and more wolf guards were surrounding him, it would be a certain death if he continued to delay. The black-clothed assassin showed a bit of determination in his eyes. He was about to rush back to Longjian Pavilion with all his strength, but he didn't look at the corner outside Longjian Pavilion. A beautiful young man in fox fur and his old servant were gathering together to watch. She had met this noble young master once before in Sun's shop, and his expression was poisonous, so she had a deep impression. "I just heard from passers-by that he is the son of the prince and has a transcendent status." Normally, she would definitely not pay attention to these princes and nobles who don't know the heights of heaven and earth, but now she is in a desperate situation and seeing such a large number of hostages in front of her, what other choice can she make? The assassin in black didn't hesitate at all. He stepped hard on the long street with his embroidered shoes, almost shattering the bluestone floor tiles. He rose up in the wind and snow, rushed out a distance of more than 10 feet in the blink of an eye, and came to the handsome young master. Escort. The young master's eyes were full of fear, and he wanted to escape in a panic. The old servant Ding was so frightened that he dropped his crutches and ran away, completely ignoring the master beside him. The assassin in black seized the critical opportunity and grabbed the young master's shoulders and pulled him into his arms. He put the long sword in his hand on his neck and faced the chasing wolf guard. Stop! The centurion of the wolf guard was so frightened that his soul flew away, and he hurriedly stopped his subordinates who were still rushing forward. They knew that Su Buling was good at martial arts, but he was hit by the dragon-locking cauldron, so he could not be a match for this assassin. If the Prince of Su died at the hands of the assassin, I am afraid that from the commander Zhang Xiang to the wolf guards present, they would have to be buried with the young prince. The centurion could only stop 3 feet away with a knife and said in a hurry, "You bold thief, let go of the prince." The black-clothed assassin was a little shorter than Su Buling. He grabbed Su Buling's shoulders with one hand and clamped the sword around his neck with the other hand. The posture was a bit difficult. Her breathing was fluctuating, and she glanced at the surrounding wolf guards. "Get out of my way." The voice was a little light and empty, and the cold temperament could be felt just by hearing the voice. The breath blew by the airs, carrying the faint fragrance of orchids. Su Buling's expression was tense, and he raised his hands, signaling the wolf guards not to be impulsive. "Get out of the way, don't be impulsive. Don't talk." The black-clothed assassin said coldly, then hugged Su Buling's waist, forcibly jumped onto the wall, and rushed towards the outside of Daifang. "If he dares to catch up, I will kill him now." Many wolf guards were pale, wanting to chase but not daring to, and stood there, not knowing what to do. The assassin was holding the Prince of Su hostage, so how could they dare to chase openly? If they pushed the assassin to a dead end, all the wolf guards present would die, so they could only bite the bullet and run to block the road to prevent the thief from escaping Chang'an City. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 18. Thank you Abai, stop for the reward from the leader of the boss. The night is now dark, the lights are dim in the streets and squares of Chang'an City, and there are no pedestrians on the streets, leaving only the wind and snow in the city. Su Buling was carried by the assassin in black and moved up and down between the buildings at high speed. After leaving Daifang, the long sword around his neck was removed. Su Buling was tall and wore a thick white fox fur. To be honest, it was a bit strange to be held by a woman. The soft balls on his back were not very noticeable, but the size was quite large. After walking a certain distance between the houses, the pursuers behind him had disappeared. Su Buling thought for a while and said, "Xia Xia, you won't kill me, right? I've always behaved myself." The assassin in black was obviously injured, his steps were erratic, and while he was running away holding Su Buling's waist, a cold voice sounded again. "I won't kill you, don't panic, I will let you go when I escape." Su Buling pretended to be panicked, "Don't lie to me." The black-clothed assassin obviously rarely spoke at all. He probably didn't want to speak and was afraid of Su Buling's resistance. He was silent for a moment and then said softly, "Last time at Sun's shop, you gave the waiter a piece of silver. The shopkeeper said that you were a good person and would not kill you." Su Buling felt relieved and chuckled. "Yeah, what's the girl's name?" No response. The black-clothed assassin was walking through Chang'an City with Su Buling. Not long after, he couldn't bear the confusion in front of him. When he crossed an alley, his feet softened and he fell down. The black-clothed assassin suddenly woke up, forcibly stabilized his figure, landed lightly in the deep alley, and pushed Su Buling away. "Let's go." As he spoke, he clutched his chest and ran quickly towards the depths of the alley with his long sword in hand, his steps staggering. Su Buling stood there and patted his shoulder. There was some blood on the fur of the fox fur. He looked at the back of the black-clothed assassin running away. Not long after he turned the corner of the alley, there was a soft thud. Su Buling waited for a while before walking to the depths of the alley in the wind and snow. The female assassin in black fell to the ground, still holding the sword in her hand. Her eyebrows were long and slender, the corners of her mouth were thin, and her face was a bit cold and otherworldly, but the pale cheeks concealed her original beauty. Looking miserable. Tread. The sound of footsteps came from far away. Lao Xiao walked up to Su Buling with his cane and looked at him with a frown. I didn't realize it, but she is a rare beauty, on par with the young prince. Su Buling frowned slightly and touched his cheek. Don't compare me to women. Hey hey. Su Buling squatted down, groped around the waist and abdomen of the assassin in black, and found a jade pendant with a yin and yang fish engraved on it and the word evergreen on the back. The brand of Changqingguan. Old Xiao knelt down and looked at her carefully. Looking at this girl's grade and appearance, she should be Ning Qingyi, the apprentice of Changqing Guanguqiu. Su Buring didn't know much about Zhang Hushang, so he seemed to understand, very powerful. Lao Xiao has been surrounded by 3 religions and 9 schools all year round. When talking about the deeds of these Jianghu heroines, they are all treasures. According to rumors in the world, Ning Qingyi's parents were affected by Iron Eagle's deer hunt 10 years ago and were exiled in the world. Later, they were taken in by Changqing Temple near Wudang Mountain. They emerged at the age of 13 and grew up to be as beautiful as a country. But Ning Qingyi I rarely go down the mountain, and only a few have actually seen it. This statement came from the mouth of a well-informed stinker in Wudang. Ning Qingyi's master, Gu Qiu Zhenren, came from the Tang family in Kaifeng. During the Suen He period, she was also a beauty known to the north and the south. Later she became a Taoist nun. This girl knew how to use the Tang family sword but was not satisfied with it. I am afraid this is the reason. Su Buling naturally couldn't figure out the messy relationships in the world, so he knelt down and took a few glances. No wonder you are covering your face. If Zhang Xiang recognizes you, Changqingguan will be in a lot of trouble. Lao Xiao nodded. If you dare to enter the capital to assassinate, you must have a blood feud with Zhang Xiang. Handing it over to the wolf guard can allow Zhu Manzi to enter the emperor's camp directly. However, Zhang Xiang stays in the archives all year round, and Zhu Manzi will easily be arrested if he goes in to explore the secrets. I found out. What do you think of the arrangements, young prince? Su Buling chuckled. You mean, use her to lure the tiger away from the mountain, so that Zhu Manzi can take the opportunity to go in and find information about the dragon locking Gu. Old Xiao rubbed his crutch and smiled. The main reason is that I am an old man and I can't bear to destroy the flowers with my hands. The flowers in the world need to be cared for by lustful people like us. Stop it. Su Buling shook his head helplessly, untied his white fox fur from his body, covered Ning Qingyi's body, hugged her sideways and walked towards an empty courtyard in the alley. Beyond the old courtyard wall, the yard is covered with fallen leaves and the windows of the houses are riddled with holes. Lao Xiao pushed open the courtyard door and scanned around. After making sure there was no problem, he walked to the well and fetched a bucket of water. Su Buling put Ning Qingyi on the bed, covered her whole body with a fox fur quilt, sat on the edge of the bed, took out Ning Qingyi's wrist, clasped her slender fingers on it, and briefly checked her pulse. You suffered internal injuries. I'm afraid you won't be able to wake up in a short time. Do you have any medicine for the injuries? Lao Xiao put the bucket next to him and took out a small porcelain vase from his arms. Su Buling poured out a pill, opened Ning Qingyi's dark lips and stuffed it in. Ning Qingyi's cold cheeks showed a bit of pain, and her brows were furrowed. Within half a quarter of an hour, beads of sweat appeared on her forehead, and her face gradually turned red and bloody. After Lao Xiao looked at it for a few times, he turned around and walked out of the room. I'm afraid Mrs. Lu already knows the news that the young prince has been kidnapped. She must go back before dawn to avoid causing uproar in the city. Okay. Su Buring chuckled, stood up and closed the door, looked around, smashed the old wooden table with one palm, picked up the broken boards, and started to repair the broken windows. The cold wind swept through the old courtyard, and the wooden frames of the windows that had been aged over time were swaying. Woo! A vague murmur sounded in the dim cabin. Ning Qingyi opened her sleepy eyes, and in a daze, she felt warm all over her body, but the place she lay on was relatively hard, and her whole body was sore and unspeakably uncomfortable. After a while, Ning Qingyi turned around, her slender eyes suddenly turned sharp, and she turned up and grabbed the sword beside her. The long blue sword was unsheathed with a clang, and the blade pointed at the window. Dong dong dong. There was a fire folding stand at the head of the bed, and the light was like a beam, illuminating the distance a few feet in front of him. Through the dim light of the fire, you can see a tall man standing next to the window. He is wearing a white robe and is tapping on the window with a broken wooden board. The weather is too cold and he is wearing thin clothes. He rubs his hands from time to time. The man didn't look older, he was 17 or 18 years old, and he was very handsome. He was obviously a pampered rich man, and he didn't know how to do such chores. The window was crookedly blocked, and there was a lot of dust on his robe. Ning Qingyi held his sword flat for only a moment, then felt a splitting headache and fell down on the bed again. He looked down and saw that he was covered with a gorgeous snow-white fox fur. His clothes were intact, but the fox fur was too warm and he was sweating a little. The collar was untied a little. I don't know if it was done by someone else's hands or if he untied it himself when he was unconscious. Ning Qingyi blinked her eyes and lay weakly on the bed. The sword in her hand slipped to the ground. Su Buling was repairing the window and noticed the noise beside the bed. He turned his head and showed a friendly smile. "Girl, are you awake? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is very fierce." Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 19. The night was quiet and the cottage was silent. Ning Qingyi's eyes were a little wary, but more of a puzzlement. He pursed his lips to relieve the discomfort in his throat, and then spoke weakly. "Why didn't you leave?" Su Buling was repairing the window and said casually, "I just walked a short distance and saw you lying on the ground. The weather is so cold, you will definitely get frostbite by tomorrow morning, so I brought you here. There should be no one living in this yard. I was afraid that the landlord would come over to make a fire, and there was no firewood." His voice was gentle and magnetic, just like talking to an old friend he hadn't seen for many years, without any arrogance of an ordinary rich boy. Ning Qingyi closed his eyes and concentrated for a moment. His complexion gradually recovered, his breath became smoother, and his mind gradually became clearer. He tilted his head to look at Su Buling, who was talking to himself, and was silent for a long while. "Why did you save me?" Su Buling blinked his eyes, slightly amused. "When you meet someone who is about to die, you can't just leave him alone. Just now you said that I am a good person and don't kill people. I think you should be a female knight, the kind of person who is moral." Ning Qingyi sat up with difficulty, holding the furry fox fur on his body, still a little alert. "You report me to the police and arrest me, which is a great achievement. If you save me, the murderers of the investigation department will definitely make trouble for you." Su Buling heard this, shook his head and smiled. "I am the eldest son of Su Wangsuyu. You are so bold to kidnap me. I will not cause trouble for the investigation department when I go back. What trouble can there be?" Ning Qingyi was stunned, and then he remembered how transcendent Su Buling's identity was. How could an investigation department dare to cause trouble for the Su family of a different surname? She thought for a moment. I have heard of General Su's reputation. Today, I had no choice but to offend you. My name is Ning King Yi. I owe you a favor and will repay you in the future. Su Buling shook his head, took the wine gourd from his waist, and handed it to Ning King Yi. Killing an official is equivalent to rebellion. I saved you because I don't want to watch you freeze to death. If you are a traitor, cut off your relationship with me and pretend that what happened tonight never happened. Ning Qingyi took the wine gourd and nodded slightly. I assassinated Zhang Xiang just to avenge a personal vengeance. 10 years ago, Zhang Xiang killed my mother. People in the martial arts world take revenge when they have vengeance and repay kindness when they have kindness. It is not rebellion. As he spoke, he picked up the wine pot and took a sip from his slightly pale thin lips. The broken jade was very hot, and it was inevitable that he could not bear to drink it in his weak body. He held it in for a long time before he recovered his breath. Su Buling curled his lips. The girl is really pretty. Perhaps because she had never seen such a straight man's way of flirting with girls, Ning Qingyi raised her eyebrows slightly with a bit of inexplicable. In the past, she would definitely fight back, but the other party had done her a favor, so she just smiled and changed the subject. Your name is Su Buling. Yes, girl, have you heard of my name? Ning Qingyi thought about it and nodded slightly. I used to hear from the masters in the martial arts world that there was a genius in Ziliang, who seemed to have dragon tendons, tiger bones, and unicorn strength, a martial arts genius that is rare in a century. An old Taoist priest from Wudang Mountain even ran over to take him in as a disciple, but unfortunately that person's status was too high, and he looked down on those who mixed in the martial arts world, so he drove the old Taoist priest out. Is he talking about you? Su Buling nodded. In the past, he was arrogant and indeed drove many martial arts masters out of the door. I was young and ignorant at that time. If those seniors in the martial arts world come to visit me now, will you become my disciple? I will give them some travel expenses so that they won't feel so embarrassed when they leave. Ning Qingyi blinked, hesitating to speak, and finally just shook his head and smiled. His temperament is naturally cold, and this smile really has a bit of the coldness of a snow lotus blooming. Ning Qingyi took a short break, and his strength was mostly restored. He opened the fox fur and sat down on the wooden bed. He picked up the long sword on the ground and looked at Su Buling standing next to him. Are you poisoned? Su Buling nodded, a little helpless. The girl has good eyesight. Ning Qingyi pondered for a while, and suddenly reached out and grabbed Su Buling's wrist, feeling it a little. Su Buling didn't resist, but just smiled. Ning Qingyi felt the pulse for a moment, and then a bit of caution appeared between his eyebrows. He looked at her carefully again. Last time in Sun's shop, I saw that you looked weak and had been drinking strong liquor for many years, so I guessed that you were really poisoned by the dragon locking goo. Su Buling took back his hand. Miss, do you have a way to detoxify? Ning Qingyi shook his head. The dragon locking goo is a strange poison. The martial arts of those who are poisoned will be reduced to 1 in 10. Once you force your qi to move, you will either die or be disabled. Most of them will not live more than 3 years if they lie down honestly. I haven't heard of any way to resolve it. You can move freely, so your martial arts must have been very high in the past. Su Buling smiled friendly. In the past, you were only a little worse than the girl, and you were also a hero. Now you are not much different from a useless person. When a warrior loses his skills, it is equivalent to a gentry losing his family and property. Few people in the world can bear such a blow. Ning Qingyi's eyes showed some size. He moved to the side a little, patted the bedboard and signaled Su Buling to sit down. It's very uncomfortable usually, right? I heard that if you are infected with the dragon locking goo, you will suffer from the pain of thousands of ants gnawing at your heart day and night, and it's worse than death. Su Buling sat side by side with Ning Qingyi on the bed. Drinking strong liquor can temporarily suppress the poison, but it's actually nothing. Who hurt you? Hmm. Su Buling frowned and thought for a while, then shook his head gently. I don't know, I'm investigating secretly. If it's a revenge by a gangster, it's okay, but if... Su Buling stopped talking here, looked in the direction of the palace, and sighed softly. If, as he thought, the emperor was behind this to make the line of Prince Su extinct or to reduce the power of the feudal lords, he might not have left Chang'an alive. Ning Qingyi sensed the worry in Su Buling's mood and hesitated for a moment. Your family is so good, detoxification should not be a problem. The disease comes from the heart. If you relax, you may live 2 more days. Obviously, Ning Qingyi is not very good at comforting people. Su Buling nodded and smiled, and his eyes turned to the green blade long sword between the two of them. The sword is 3 feet and 2 inches long, the hilt is wrapped with green rope, and the scabbard must be newly matched, which is a bit inappropriate. Su Buling used to be obsessed with martial arts, and he knew more about weapons than poetry and books. After taking a few glances, he picked up the long sword, flicked his finger and the sword came out 3 inches, showing a cold light under the dim light of the fire stick. Su Buling's fingers rubbed over the edge of the sword. Good sword, is this a sign of sadness? Ning Qingyi looked at the slender sword blade, with a bit of sadness in his eyes. My mother's sword died at the hands of Zhang Xiang 10 years ago. The sword was taken away by the court and was only snatched back today. Su Buling put the sword back into the scabbard, thought about it, but had nothing to say. Ning Qingyi was obviously a man of few words, and Su Buling was also a man of few words, so the room fell silent. Ning Qingyi raised his hand, hooked the hair by his ear, and took a sip of the wine gourd to drive away the cold and quench his thirst. Perhaps he felt that the current atmosphere was a bit strange, but he didn't know how to communicate with this powerful prince's son. After half a night of tossing and turning, it was already early morning. Su Buling didn't stay for long. He picked up the wine gourd and stood up. I'll take my leave first. The Imperial Guards will search the city soon to find me. I'll say hello to the Imperial Guards and tell them that you have escaped from the city. You can rest here for a few days. Ning Qingyi naturally believed what he said because he didn't harm Ning Qingyi when he was unconscious. He hesitated for a moment and asked softly. Why are you helping me? Everyone has a desire for beauty. Men are all like this. Su Buling said casually and went out to close the door. Ning Qingyi was stunned for a moment, and it took him a while to react. His cold face showed a bit of annoyance. After scolding Leche vaguely, he lay down. But soon, she found a furry fox fur coat beside her. Thinking of Su Buling's poisoning and cold body, she sat up quickly. She was seriously injured and her steps were unsteady. She staggered to the door. Hey, wait. Opening the door, there was a snowstorm outside. There was only a series of footprints on the snow on the fallen leaves. There was no human figure. Ning Qingyi blinked, stood for a while holding the gorgeous fox fur coat, and finally just shook her head and smiled. Perhaps she felt that this little prince was not experienced in the world and was a little too stupid. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 20. It was dawn. In the bluestone alley, Su Buling walked in the light snow. He took off his fox fur and wore only a white robe. In the cold wind in the early morning of winter, he could feel the piercing cold all over his body. The dragon-locking poison in his body caused his body to be weak and cold. At this time, affected by the environment, the dull pain in his chest and abdomen was really uncomfortable. Su Buling picked up the wine gourd and shook it. There was not much left. Just now, he put it all into Ning Qingyi's mouth. Not a drop was left. There was a faint lip mark on the wine gourd. You are really welcome. Su Buling hung the gourd back on his waist and walked to the Sun family shop deep in the alley. He never thought that he would only see the wine banner swaying in the cold wind, but the door of the shop was closed. Su Buling was a little surprised. Craftsmen in the market, no matter how big or small, are very particular about which time to open the door and which time to make samples. Basically, they will never change throughout their lives. This is a respect for customers. As for the famous old shop like Son's shop, it goes without saying that shopkeeper Son may have never woken up late or left half an hour early in his life. If the opening time is irregular, he will be like this now. He ran over when he needed wine urgently, but was turned away. He had no contact information except standing outside waiting. Su Buling put his hands in his sleeves and stood under the wine banner waiting quietly. It stands to reason that an old man like shopkeeper Son would not delay too long. Unfortunately, Su Buling waited until the sky was bright, his face was already blue, and several waves of drinkers came and went in the alley, but shopkeeper Son still did not come. Su Buling frowned slightly, and could only say secretly, maybe something happened at home. After that, Su Buling walked out of the alley, got a pot of ordinary wine in the wine shop, greeted the imperial guards patrolling the street, and returned to the Prince of Yan's mansion. On the other side, the sky was just getting light. In a study room in Wenk Garden, Song Yufu, with dark circles under her eyes, sorted a pile of rice paper. Song Yufu helped her father with morning reading every day. Although she knew that the princes and nobles would not ask questions, she still had to think carefully about the content of the recitation every day in advance, so as not to be unable to answer questions when someone asked. Song Yufu would have gotten up early in normal times, but last night's Longjian poetry meeting made her feel restless for a long time. When she learned that Su Shize was kidnapped by thieves, she tossed and turned and couldn't sleep. It was dawn when she finally felt tired. Although she was worried about Su Shize's safety, she still had to do things. In addition to preparing for the lecture today, she also had to sort out the more famous poems from last night's poetry meeting and send them to the palace for the emperor to appreciate. Today's emperor values literati. In order to show his importance to students, he would also read poems written by young talents in Chang'an in his spare time. Occasionally, a few words of praise would be passed from the palace, and the literati who wrote poems would naturally become famous. Speaking of which, the talented people in Chang'an City still attach great importance to this matter. Originally, these things were done by several old teachers in the Imperial College, but her father didn't like these things that pursue fame and fortune, so he naturally handed them over to her. Speaking of which, she was quite pitiful as a daughter. The poems sent to the emperor naturally cannot be picked at random. If there are hidden poems or innuendos, it is a serious matter of death. Song Yufu compared them carefully with the oil lamp, but some poems were really unbearable to look at, such as Xiao Ting's My Prime Minister Daddy, which was written in a mess and could not be said to be bad. Song Yufu was upset after reading it for a while, and could only pick up a poem from the side of the table to look at it to cleanse her eyes. On the unsigned poem, it was written 10 years of life and death, I can't forget it without thinking about it. And so on. It is said that the current emperor is also a lovelorn man. After the queen died of illness, he has never appointed another queen. If he saw this poem, he would be deeply moved. Unfortunately, Su Shize had warned Song Yufu in advance, so Song Yufu certainly didn't dare to submit these poems. If the emperor asked who wrote them, it would cause big trouble. Song Yufu picked them up and read them for a while. No matter how she looked at them, she felt that these poems could not be written by someone else. There was no one with such good literary talent in the Dayu dynasty, and she had been in contact with Su Shize for so long, she felt that Su Shize had hidden a lot of things, and it was not impossible for him to write these poems. But Su Shize insisted that he copied them, and Song Yufu had no choice but to appreciate them alone. From the dim lights, she sat until the sky was slightly bright. Song Yufu didn't sleep all night, and gradually began to nod like a chicken pecking at rice. I don't know how long it took, but there was a bell outside. Dong dong. Song Yufu woke up suddenly, and her face turned pale in fear. The morning bell should be the beginning of the morning reading. Most of the students have arrived at the Imperial College. She was dazed and obviously late. The teacher is a role model, and being late is no small matter. If her father finds out, he will scold her. Oh no, oh no. Song Yufu stood up in a hurry and ran towards the schoolhouse of Wenk Garden. At this time, she could only hope that her father didn't find out. Those princes and nobles never care about morning reading, and they don't think they will say much. Soon, the sound of reading aloud came from the study not far away. After a long time, the study room, which was originally for the teacher to rest, heard footsteps again. Song Baking walked quickly through the corridor and entered the study room with his hands behind his back. A little eunuch followed behind him, wiping the sweat from his forehead, and kept urging him in a hoarse voice. Master Song, the morning court should be over in an hour or so. It stands to reason that the things sent to the palace should be taken to the gate of the Imperial College half a quarter of an hour ago. I waited left and right, but he didn't come. If the emperor comes later and wants to take a look, I must be beaten. Song Baking frowned. I know, this girl is getting more and more unruly as she grows older. As he spoke, he walked into the study and looked around. There was no one in the room and the desk was in a mess. Song Baking walked up to the two piles of manuscripts and took a look at them. He then gathered the better quality manuscripts together and handed them to the eunuch. The young eunuch was a person close to the current emperor. After taking the manuscript, he thought for a while and asked, "Your Majesty usually doesn't leave the palace, so he just reads these things to relieve his boredom. I was waiting outside just now, and I heard from the students that a good poem was produced at the Longian poetry meeting yesterday, and it was written by Prince Su. Is this true?" Song Baking frowned slightly. It has not been determined yet, and the students are just guessing. Last night, there was an assassin in Longian Pavilion, and Prince Su was abducted and his whereabouts are unknown. The investigation department is suppressing the news and searching for it. Don't alarm your Majesty first. The young eunuch thought about it, so he didn't ask any more questions. He held a stack of manuscripts and walked out of the Imperial College quickly. A new week has begun, please give me some recommendation votes. Thanks to the following big guys for their rewards. De Shanzi. Book Friend 202005011139011816. Xiao Luo Luo. Hunks Zhang. The Rest of My Life N. Mr. Dianban. Suzai. Mr. Dianban. Ma Xiao's Huai Shui Shui. It's also out today. I know it's so hard to come up with a name. Wu Nian Jing'an. Book Friends 201808271018405539. Civilized Villain I. One calamity is stronger than 6 calamities. Yalan Jun Zth. Name is a pearl. Don't make the name too long, just like this. I'm different. Fluffy Chow Chow. Kagai. Harem is all in. Clouds press down on the sound of thunder and the ground. Peninsula Iron Box. A 123. For the dead. Missing what I miss. The evening breeze is getting cooler. Have you ever regretted it? I'm a road bully. Bikini Beach Squidward. Yuta Sky. Please pity me in the book shortage. Go up to the high building alone to enjoy the bright moon. Ibuki is my wife. It seems too long, I'll open a single sheet once a week to thank you.